Maureen O'Neill, the Director of Exhibitions and Educational Programming here. And we're so thrilled to have our special guest with us.
Thank you, too, for not saying the years of my degrees. Well, thank you all for coming here. It's a real pleasure, and thank you to Maureen for the wonderful invitation. And I'm very excited to talk about SECCA. This is a kind of not off the cuff, because I did actually plan it, but it is more informal, I hope is the word. So I'll just be kind of walking back and forth and talking about some things. And the first part of it is kind of informative. It's about who we are as SECCA and what we're doing. And then the second part is a little bit more of an argument about what I think contemporary art centers should be doing in the world, and the role that I think we should be playing there. So bear with me on that, and I hope that sparks some conversation, because I don't think I'll be talking for the full 45 minutes, but we'll see where we go. I did want to point out that I put the North Carolina Museum of Art logo on there because since 2007, SECCA has actually been a part of the North Carolina Museum of Art. It was a private institution prior to that, had financial troubles, and was picked up by the state, put under the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and made an affiliate of the North Carolina Museum of Art. You wouldn't have known that for about 10 years after that, because there wasn't a whole lot of partnerships going on between those two organizations. And I'll talk a little bit more about when and how those partnerships came about now. But we're moving to fully integrate into the NCMA. The SECCA Board of Trustees, our nonprofit board, recently voted to dissolve so that they could move into the NCMA Foundation Board so that we could become one entity across the state. So we're really excited about that. The state has put us in their budget for the first time for some capital funds and some operating funds. So we're moving in some right directions. I should say the House put us in the budget. The Senate still has to pass that. The governor signed it. You're on a private campus, you don't have to worry about that so much, but it's that sort of stuff for us. So anyway, attention as caring in the Contemporary Art Center is the topic, and I'll explain some of that as we move forward. So I want us to think about attention as both an ethic, right, and as a resource, right? So attention is both a form of caring, right? What we pay attention to grows, right? What we pay attention to does better. What we pay attention to is a way of showing our values and how we live out those values. But also, attention is a type of economy. Attention is a type of currency. When you think about paying attention to things, that's a metaphor, right, for time as money, right? One of the entailments of that metaphor. You pay attention to things. So we pay attention to people and businesses who want our time, right? And if you think about all the places that you go on a daily basis, and even virtually or physically, how many of those places are bombarding you with messages or ads or something trying to get your attention? They're trying to sell you something, yes, but the metric that they're using is actually whether or not you've glanced at it. That becomes the data, right? So the second thing here, people wanting our time, wanting us to pay attention to them, often hampers that first thing. We're so busy paying attention to those things that we often can't pay attention to the things we want to pay attention to or believe we should be paying attention to. So this is my general thesis, and I'll come back to this at the end. But we're a public arts institution. We're a great example, I think, of a private-public partnership. But as a public arts institution, we should model attention as an ethic of care while providing what I'm going to call accessible shelter from the constant demands of what we've come to know as the attention economy, right? So as a public arts organization, and I'll show you a little bit about the resources and the facility that we have an obligation, as does, I think, a lot of higher ed institutions, right? To be a place where you're not constantly bombarded. You know, for example, we're going to put a cafe in SECCA. We don't have one yet, and most museums should have a cafe because you should be drinking coffee while you're looking at art. But it's the idea of that cafe is you can buy a cup of coffee, but we are not there to sell you a cup of coffee. And I really want to make that distinction, right? The cup of coffee is there, and we would like to be compensated for the cost that it comes to us to make that cup of coffee. But we're not marketing that, and you're not getting signs screaming at you to buy more coffee, right? There's a difference to that, and so hold that in mind, I think, as we go through there. This actually is a picture of our pond, and we had some temporary sculptures up there. And this gentleman is enjoying a concert on a lake on a stage in our pond, which is right to the other side of the screen there. So attention as an ethic, right? So attention as a way of caring. What you're seeing here is our auditorium. We have a wonderful, 290-seat auditorium with actually drop-dead acoustics. It's a great place to hear a band and to see a movie or whatever. But what we did last summer, is we turned it over to our summer camps. And these are kids who are actually making fabric sculptures. They're making sort of stuffed sculptures. So they spent a week kind of designing and sewing fabrics together and stuffing them and then making a quilt out of some other things. But you'll see what I love about this picture is just how intent they all are. Right? They're not staring off into space. They're not looking at the camera. They almost have their Michael Jordan tongues out, right? They're just kind of looking and this is the kind of attention we'd like kids to learn how to give, right? How do you go into the deep kind of work, that flow kind of state where there's not something distracting you from that at every minute. So that's part of our summer camp program, but also another look at some of our resources, facilities there. All right, let me walk you through a couple of key years, and this is actually that pond. That was that stage I was talking about. That pond looks up to the back of this house. That house was owned by James G. Haynes, who is one of 7 sons and 2 daughters of John Wesley and Anna Hodgins Haynes. John Wesley Haynes and his brother owns Haynes Tobacco, which you wouldn't have heard of because in 1900 they sold it to Reynolds. And you would know Reynolds Tobacco for the neat little sum of $1 million in 1900. He got bored and they started Haynes Hosiery. So Haynes t-shirts, all of that kind of stuff was part of this James G. Haynes' family. But the brothers and sisters all went on to do interesting things. One of them was the first American in Hitler's bunker at the end of World War II, and also took over part of the Marshall Plan. One of them was in the Treasury Department. So, they all were city councilmen or mayors or county councilmen. So there was a real ethic of civic duty to the Haynes family. They all served in various wars during their generations. So James G. Haynes willed the estate. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. In 1956, the sort of learned and also, just frankly rich folks of Winston-Salem decided they needed some kind of access to contemporary art. That contemporary art was existing in New York and a little bit in Los Angeles at that time and in Paris, but it wasn't coming down to the Southeast very much. So they funded what would become the Winston-Salem Art Gallery, right? And that was in downtown Winston-Salem. And the whole point of that was to bring artists and their work to Winston-Salem so that people could experience it, but also so they could buy it and so that they could sort of stock up on it. But they really wanted to actually bring fine contemporary art to Winston-Salem as a way of culturizing the place, I guess, but they didn't think of it as podunk. They thought of it as worthy of this art. Does that make sense? So it wasn't like they were just saying, "Oh, Winston-Salem stinks. We need fine art." They're like, "Winston-Salem's great, but we don't have any fine art. So how do we get it down here?" And so that became their motive for that. So that lasted from 1956 to 1972, when James G. Haynes passed away. He willed his estate to the Winston-Salem Art Gallery for the purpose of displaying art in a home-like setting. That was one of the deeds of gifts there. It was 32 acres at the time. It includes a pond and a lot of wooded area. So he gave them the house, And they walked through the house and they're like, we can't really show art everywhere in this house. So they built a gallery. So they built a modern gallery. This first half of this gallery on this side of it, they built in 1974. And then they renamed it the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art. And I wish there was a legitimate reason for that name, but it really was three guys in a room saying, what do we call this? How about the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art? And somebody said, that seems presumptuous. And they said, let's see who calls us on it. And nobody did, and there it was. So they called it the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art. So that's 1974. And they actually were building quite a reputation. And they started what was called the Awards in Visual Arts in the early 80s, like 81. And the Awards for Visual Art was through the National Endowment for the Arts. Then this is important. The NEA was funding that award, and SECCA would line up curators and other experts. They would judge it. They would pick the winners of this national award, and then they would show it at SECCA and then also travel it around. Now, the reason that's important is that in 1988, one of the winners of that award was Andre Serrano. And Andre Serrano had a piece called the Piss Christ, which was a crucifix in a jar of his own urine. And there was a photo of it. And all hell broke loose because they wondered, the people like Jesse Helms and Alphonse D'Amato in the US Senate wondered why the National Endowment for the Arts was funding this blasphemous piece of art. And so they had to, my good friend Reg Haynes, who's the grandson of James G. Haynes, and his cousin Borden Haynes, had to go to DC several times to defend the NEA because D'Amato and Helms and others wanted to defund it and do away with it entirely, right? So in 1988, the NEA ends up losing a chunk of its funding. The other thing that happens for SECCA, though, is that we become that place, right? We become the place. Now, here's the other funny thing about that point. That picture never actually was on SECCA's grounds. It was in the catalog for the show entirely, but it never hung on the wall at SECCA. So it also was this sort of blown out of proportion kind of thing. One of those prints actually exists in somebody's house in Winston-Salem. She bought it and brought it back, but that's an interesting side to that. So 1988, what happens then is they decide to go big and build this wing. That's where that auditorium is, and it's another large gallery. And quite frankly, it's a bit of a folly because what happens also in 1988 and through the early 90s is that most of the corporations start leaving Winston-Salem. So Nabisco pulls out of Reynolds and leaves. BB&T kind of goes away, or Wachovia goes away. Other kind of big corporations go away. And the reason that hurts is that Winston's a relatively small city. I mean, nationally, it's a small city. The only folks funding SECCA were the corporations and then some rich families, right? So you did not have the support for it. So by 2007, they're pretty much out of money because look at all that they have to take care of, right? So they're going to close. And Reg Haynes and the Haynes Foundation says, well, if you close, this is a funny story, says if you close, we've got to take this property back and we don't want it because we don't want to take care of it. So they worked a deal to get it taken over by the state, right? So the state takes over SECCA in 2007, right? Does some minor upgrades to it, installs a director, but that's when we become part of the NCMA. 2018 is important because that is when Dr. Valerie Hillings takes over the NCMA. She's the new director. It's not important because I was hired in 2019, but it's important because she was hired in 2018 to sort of follow Larry Wheeler, who did great work expanding the NCMA. But she really had a mission to sort of now make it that kind of welcoming, diverse, accessible place. And she was responsible for hiring me And we work closely together to align SECCA with the NCMA's values. What you see over here is actually one of the first kind of marketing and branding documents we created that kind of is a throwback to the history of the Haynes House and to SECCA, but also shows some of, I think, the whimsical nature that we're really trying to show with the place. So that's a brief rundown of where we are now. Physically, not much has changed. We are in the middle of doing a grounds plan, which will actually, I think, significantly alter the property in some really great ways. So what is SECCA paying attention to? What you're seeing here is actually part of the installation of Beverly McKeever's retrospective. Beverly McKeever is an artist from Greensboro. She now teaches at Duke. She's got an international reputation for her portraiture. Lots of loose brushwork, color. She works actually, if you're looking at this photo here, she was at Grimsley High School in Greensboro, and she joined the clown club. And she's black, and they made her wear like white clown makeup, and they wouldn't let her wear black clown makeup. What she's done now is a number of portraits and self-portraits wearing black clown makeup. And of course this gets controversial because folks are like, well, it looks like blackface. But she'll argue it's not, it's clown makeup. But it's also a way of hiding identity, right? And shielding identity in that. So anyway, what are we paying attention to? Well, narratives just like that, really, right? Beverly McKeever grew up in the projects in Greensboro. Some of you might know about the story of the Greensboro KKK riot and the shots that happened right in front of her door in Greensboro, right? So she sort of grew up with this kind of strife. This is the kind of artist and the kinds of stories, right, that we kind of the narratives that we want to tap into, right? What we care about, what we're trying to pay attention to is, are the artists and the work that they're doing sort of relevant to our communities, right? Do they make people feel welcomed and safe in our spaces, right? We have a lot to do as a contemporary art museum to be more welcoming, to be warmer, right? To offer our facilities and our resources to groups that go beyond those corporations and the rich white families that sponsored us in the first place, especially now that we're private, right? So that's what we are paying attention to now. So what you have here is the 4 points of the NCMA and SECCA's larger strategic plan. We had a strategic plan that we created, and when we lined it up with NCMA, we realized all of our points were pretty similar, so we kind of merged together and created one language for our strategic plan. What you're seeing here too is actually the opening of Freeman Vines' Hanging Tree Guitars. So Freeman Vines is a Eastern Carolina artist who actually carves and makes guitars out of found material, all of them playable. But he actually was making guitars. Some of these guitars were from the wood of a tree that was used in lynchings in eastern North Carolina. And so you'll see, this is our main gallery space, cavernous, but holds a lot of people. It's beautiful. It's difficult to program at times, but it allows us to do shows like this. This was a branch of a tree that we hung from the roof, and then the guitars kind of hung from that. And you wouldn't see it until you came around this wall, so it was this interesting reveal for those of you who think about designing exhibitions. So we're interested in, this, right? Forging distinctive artistic path that honors excellence, innovation, and diverse narratives, right? SECCA had a criticism, especially in its leaner years, that the art really wasn't very good, that we weren't able to kind of bring exhibitions that were of the caliber that most people would want. But at the same time, SECCA's history of exhibitions is actually very diverse in terms of who's being shown, who's doing the curating, and who's doing the programming, not so diverse, right? But who's being shown was actually diverse, and so there's still work to be done there. Create authentic, inclusive, and welcoming experiences that engage that broader audience. So that's programming, right? That's how you think about your education and your outreach. Advance that ambitious campus plan so that we can be coherent, cohesive. And create inclusive systems, processes, and capacity for operational excellence. And that's all internal, right? That's how are we getting our hiring ads out? Who are we contacting for that? What are we thinking about in terms of how we're training people and how we're bringing people into the system? So all of these are kind of measurable by metrics too. You know, I was in higher ed. I understand learning outcomes and needing to measure them and all those and strategic goals and all that. And so we do think about, you know, how are we going to keep track of these things? How are we going to make sure that we're constantly working in these ways? So distinctive artistic path. You know, since the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and others, a lot of museums and galleries and art centers really had to be thinking about which artists, not only which artists they're showing, but which artists even have access to being shown there, right? Like which artists even have a chance of being shown there. And so it's really about going out and looking in places that you wouldn't have normally looked, right? Or making sure you're contacting people who can contact other communities and other places so that you can find these things. It also means hiring, and we'll get to that. I'm not meaning to diminish that. We'll talk about that in the fourth thing. So thinking about who can kind of talk or walk into communities, establish meaningful, warm relationships so that you can find artists and people there who might be able to show in your space. Down in the corner, that's Beverly McKeever in the yellow glasses. She was great. We had a wonderful opening with her. Up in the middle is Vitus Shell. His show is up right now. There's some gallery guides, some seasonal guides that left over there if you're interested in seeing what we got going on. But that Vitus' Shell runs through the summer, and he's doing wonderful portraits of folks in his community of Monroe, Louisiana. And so what he wanted to do there was show them in some of their natural poses. But if you see, and I'm not an art historian, but if you see it, there's a gilded frame around those. There's a lot of sort of medieval kinds of things happening in there, some very formal techniques, while you're looking at very contemporary subject matter, right? And so this has been, for a while, we had Beverly's portraits and Vitus's portraits up at the same time. And it was this wonderful conversation between one generation of Black portrait artists and another generation of Black portrait artists. It was actually pretty cool to walk between the galleries. Kukuli Velarde is doing the sculptures. She's Peruvian. She's coming in the end of the summer. So there's, I think, 20 or so or more of those kind of sculptures that are going to be placed around that main gallery. And Emilio Rojas, who's from Mexico, will be doing some performance pieces and some installation pieces. He's doing a show called Tracing a Wound Through My Body, which is about border existence and the body as a place of negotiating borders and things like that. So, you know, we're trying to tell different narratives here. We're trying to, you know, open it up to different stories. And I think we're doing a good enough job. I think we hired 2 new curators who split their time between SECCA and the NCMA. Maya Brooks is assistant curator of contemporary art. Jared Ledesma is, he's a full curator of 20th and 21st century art. And they're now planning their shows. These were not their shows. So they're in the process of getting their shows up. Jared has a show on queer futurism that'll be opening soon, next year, I believe. Maya's doing several shows, a mural show with 3 artists, 2 of them from Atlanta, a fiber show, so a show of fiber arts, which is going to be really cool, and also a Southern religions show, which are all in the docket. So then, authentic and inclusive and welcoming, how we do that through our programming and through our outreach, right? This is also one of our second Saturday exhibitions, so we try to provide high quality art supplies second Saturday of every month so that families can come in. We give them some instruction, and we just let them kind of run free on it. But it's a chance for, we're open 10 to 1, or that runs 10 to 1, and families can come in and let the kids sort of play and make art. It's actually kind of fun to watch. What you see in the middle is actually our new portable gallery program. And so what we do there is we buy art from regional artists at market price, and we put them in interesting carrying cases that we can then bring to schools, 3 or 4 at a time. And so the art teachers in Forsyth County and the surrounding, and even math teachers and literature teachers will say, you know, I'm doing a lesson on this. Do you have anything that kind of works? Or I want to open this up for students. So this was a 2nd grade class that kind of showed up, and we're looking at the art. And this is a great opportunity then for you to see art that's made by people, much of which is made by folks in Winston-Salem, much of which is made from folks from their neighborhoods or from their communities. And they get a chance to kind of talk to our educator about what's going on in that. Down below is a series called Lyrics by the Lake that is actually a community generated. That came to us. They saw the space. It's spoken word and jazz and some comedy, but that happens like once a month now, either outside or inside. Up top is one of the artists we had for what we call our Night Moods series, which is actually electronic dance music concerts, which we do in the main living room of the Haynes house. But this is, again, one of those ways of creating different avenues of access, right? So if you're not into if you don't think you're into contemporary art, but you like club music, this is a way to get into the space, right? And have a good time, and then maybe you stumble upon some art. And that is actually the living room of the Haynes house right there. So this is part of what we are redesigning. The house was built in 1930. It's got gorgeous architecture and all these rich walls, and we are filling that with contemporary furniture. We're filling that with furniture that's designed from the mid-century on. So you can walk in and sit on a knoll couch and a Bertoia chair and these other kinds of named pieces of furniture, and it's open to the public to sit on, and it's not a showroom. So you can, eventually you'll be able to get a cup of coffee or open up your laptop and sit on an actual designed piece of furniture. It's a way of showing that design is one of the contemporary arts, but it's also about showing how functional it can be. That's the logo for the Haynes house that we just put outside. So we're branding that as an event space for people to come and be able to kind of hang out and really just enjoy company and be in the presence of some art that we'll commission for the walls. So this is the master plan when we talk about finding a cohesive plan for the grounds. And if you're not familiar with the grounds, this won't make a lot of sense to you, but none of this really exists yet. So this giant trail around here does not exist, but this is all about 20 acres. The building is here. We worked with the Sawtooth School for Visual Arts. They put 2 wood-fired kilns on our property for pottery classes. So they're these awesome giant things that shoot flames 4 feet in the air, but they create really cool looking pottery that comes out of that. So we're going to turn this into a kind of a maker's park area and an amphitheater with a stage. We're thinking a lot about stormwater preservation and how to treat stormwater, trying to make this more, not only more accessible, but more sustainable with more trees, play areas around, that sort of stuff. But boardwalk that goes around the lake. So you see that we're in the middle of a neighborhood. I didn't really say that. It's not like you have to drive down a side street to find us. So think about where rich people built their houses, right? They didn't build them on the main roads. So we're in the middle, we're in the woods, and now we're in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. And so to get there, there's really only one road in. So we have to do things that are not only going to bring people down, but give them reason to stay on the grounds for multiple time. There'll be some sculpture spots all around, so we can rotate sculpture around us as well. And then, of course, inclusive systems. And so a lot of what we're thinking about is how we're hiring, where our hiring ads go out, who we're bringing in as consultants, and also who gets to actually access the space. This was actually a group called METL, M-E-T-L. I can't remember what that stands for, but it has something to do with metaverse something. But you see they're looking at their metaverse helmets there. And this was a program that school out of the UNCSA they asked if they could use the space so they could show off their software. Lyrics by the Lake is one of those. We have other kinds of programming like fireside chats in that chair at the Haynes House there, where we put artists just in conversation with each other so they can talk about their processes in front of a group of people. So we're really thinking about who has access and who can actually help program the space and give us feedback on what the spaces can and should do. And that's an ongoing opportunity for us. All right, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about this idea of attention as resource. Has anybody heard the term attention economy before? Okay, so the attention economy is essentially, the reason I put this picture here, by the way, is that everybody here is engaged in conversation and she's posting to Instagram. And that's exactly that's actually doing us a favor because we need people to post us to Instagram. But it's really funny that here's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, the phone is dinging, there's something drawing her away, and this is you see these conversations going without their phones, right? It's just an interesting juxtaposition. But the attention economy is the first thing to remember about it is that if you're not paying for a service like Facebook or Instagram or something, you are both the labor and the product of that service. You're creating the content, right? You're pushing it out there. But you're also the product in the sense that you are the one who's consuming the ads that are coming back at you. So you're the one who's being sold to the folks who are making the ads or to the conglomerates that are making the ads. So whenever you're engaging in any of this kind of stuff, it's all great. It's not a critique of it, but understand that if you're not paying for it and therefore they're not cutting down ads, your presence there is actually what's paying somebody else, right? Time and attention are, of course, sort of limited resources, and they're valuable because they constrain how much information you can consume. So a lot of what happens is they'll look at how long you've stayed on an ad or how long you've stayed on a particular page. All that data gets collected, right? And all that becomes part of what they can sell back to the companies. They could say, well, on our platform, people in this area spend 3 seconds looking at ads, which is a second longer than what they get somewhere else, right? At the same time, your time and attention are limited. You're making an economic choice when you choose to spend your time and your energy doing something like that, because you only have so much of it, right? Businesses then transmute your attention into capital by packaging your data and then selling it, and that's what they use to set advertising rates, right? So that's the business transaction part of it. This is interesting. It's the information and attention economy. Nothing's really created. There's not like palpable goods that are being created, right? And that's why it's not a growth economy, because you can't pack any more hours into a day, right? So all you can do is hope to get people to stop spending their time over here, maybe spending it over here, but the economy itself can't grow, right? So the attention economy just pervades all these areas, right? It's everywhere we go. It's in work, it's in our personal, and it's certainly in our social lives. Just a couple of book suggestions if you're interested in this kind of stuff before I talk about some other things. There's 2 here by Jenny Odell. How to Do Nothing was her first book. Saving Time is her most recent. Resisting the Attention Economy, and then actually kind of rethinking the concept of time, right? We think of time as money. We think of time as units that we sell. When we work somewhere, if you're on the clock, right, your every hour is worth a certain wage back to you, right? If you're salaried, then all of your time is worth a certain amount of time, and so forth. But we constantly think that way. So we're constantly making economic decisions and our own personal decisions based on that. Deep Work by Cal Newport is this great argument for why undistracted, unmediated work is very, very important to humans and to what we need to accomplish, right? And he has this great image of what he calls the eudaimonia machine, which I'm not going to say again for you, but it's this place where you can kind of walk in. It's a house, really. You walk in and think about the Haynes house. There's a salon where people can have conversations. There's a library where you can find information. There's a group workplace where you can kind of work together and do things like that. And then way off into the recesses, there's a room that doesn't have internet access and is just blocked off, and that's where you do deep work, right? So you just bring your pen and your pencil in there, and you do that deep work, and then you emerge, and you go back into the salon or you go back into the library, and that's the kind of conversation. And finally, Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown, really fascinating book about change as constant, which means we always have to be shifting how we're thinking about solving problems in the moment, because everything's always changing. But really it's an argument for being warm and welcoming and loving about how we do it. So all of this is kind of informing the kind of place I want SECCA to be, the kind of warm, sort of generative space. And there's other threads in this argument that we can pull that are really maybe more relevant to me as an ex-academic than they may be to some people in this room. But there's a lot of talk right now about the death of the humanities, the decline in like English majors and history majors, and what that's really going to mean for us as a culture if we don't have people who have that experience studying that kind of stuff, or who can work with that kind of stuff. Higher education then is part of the experience economy, right? So like a lot of people don't think of themselves necessarily as going in and anymore buying an education. They're buying the Duke experience. They're buying the UNC Chapel Hill experience. And they're less worried about what they major in or what they're going to learn there than they are about what experience they're going to pull from it. And you see a lot of universities and colleges advertising more towards the experience than towards what the education, right? You also see a lot of universities they're advertising towards what you're going to be when you leave rather than what's going to happen to you while you're there, right? It's a really interesting dynamic. The emphasis then for students' work lives, I don't know if you just saw there's a bill being prepped in the House about having middle schoolers plan out their career. So, I mean, that sends shivers down my spine, but parents seem to love it. The biological effects of technology and hyper-commercialized spaces. If you read anything about how dopamine works in our brains, every time you pick up your phone, when it dings, you're getting a hit of dopamine, which is like this pleasure chemical, and it's highly addictive. And so the reason that you're constantly reaching for your phone is because you're kind of missing that hit. And then leisure. How do we promote leisure? Leisure is actually a need, right? And the fear in the early part of the 20th century was that humans were going to have too much leisure time. We were getting so efficient that we were going to have hours every day to do nothing. What were we going to do with these people? And then we figured out how to put them to more work. That's what happened. So that's SECCA's approach then, right? Public arts institution, modeling that ethic of care, providing this shelter from the demands of this attention economy. And I want to end with this photo. This is one of those second graders who saw one of the artists' work from a Black Lives Matter march in Winston-Salem. And she was drawn to this picture and she was studying it, and our teacher said, well, why are you, studying this? What makes you like this so much? And she said, it's one of the first times I see someone who looks like me in a piece of art, right? And that's a really powerful thing, right? That is like she's identifying with it. She sees the artist and all of that. And of this class, I think 200 students from that school went through, and I think 175 of them had never been to a museum, right? And so this was really their first museum experience. So it's about making it not something that they feel like they're being judged while being in front of, but something that they can step back and make a kind of either a judgment on, or that they can have some kind of reaction to. Thank you. I hope that made sense. Happy to take some questions or have some conversation. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I think this is so awesome that you guys are bringing the art to the students. How did this start? Who started this process, and are you guys going to keep spreading? Yeah,
I've got a great director of programs. His name is Alex Brown, and towards the end of the pandemic, he came to me. He's a sweet guy. He didn't need to do this. He wrote an entire proposal and a PowerPoint. We're an office of 8 people. He didn't need to do that, but he came with all this, and he said, "Look, I realized that the roadie cases for." Like rock bands and stuff, they put their stuff in roadie cases, the black cases. He's like, we can get those made to order and we can put shelving in there that will hold the art. And then we can buy the art and we can load these into cars and we can put online what we have or whatever. We could talk to the art teachers. Art teachers come to SECCA for professional development, so we have a kind of a built-in audience. But then we can tell them that you don't need to get money to get a bus to bring your students to SECCA. We'll come there. So the idea is that every year we buy 2 or 3 more pieces. We don't accession them. So they're not meant to be permanently collected. So they are meant to actually go out, and sometimes they're going to be handled, or they're going to be whatever, touched or whatever. But the idea is that they're seeing contemporary art made by people around them. So we're expanding that program, and then we put in an American Rescue Plan Act. I'm still waiting to hear from this. I have good feelings about it with our county for the SECCA Artmobile, which would be essentially a giant transit van that would actually be able to carry the art places, but also be a mobile art studio, so that we could go to the schools, open the doors, and pull out a printing press, and do a project there. And you could also park it in front of breweries on Saturdays. So I mean, just so you can get a lot of people to see it. So that's a great question. That's where we're headed with that. Yeah. Yes.
How do you see it? I'm not quite sure how to form the question, but how do you see this attention economy or focus, and how is it positively or negatively impacting the public art scene, where people have access in the public space to take selfies or take pictures? How are you seeing that?
Actually, I think in the sense that the technology now and the social network enables people to feel comfortable interacting with that art, and you've got artists coming on the scene who are working in those different forms. I think that's great. I want to argue, I'm not a technophobe or anything like that. I think it actually is creating new avenues for creation, right? Where I get worried is in the idea that the attention economy is really just sapping us away from so much else of our potential, because we only have so much time to spend. So if we're spending that time on Instagram Reels or whatever, what are we not spending it on? And how do we get people to actually be reflective about that? Because you could sit and say, well, that reel was funny and that made me laugh and that's good too. And it's a half hour of a good time. But what else could you have done with that half hour requires reflective thinking. And that's kind of what the humanities try to teach us, right? So if we're not teaching anything reflective, then you're just kind of consuming. And I think it weakens our ability to talk to each other. It weakens our ability to have a kind of critical, intelligent discourse about things. Because all we're doing is consuming and liking and not liking, without making an argument for why you like it or why you don't like it, and crafting that in theoretical terms, right? So everything just becomes a matter of immediate personal taste. And that's okay. If I stick something in my mouth and I don't like it, that's fine. But if I'm looking at art and I just kind of walk away and go like this, I should be able to articulate some reason for why I don't think it's good or bad, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So your background is interesting as an academic and English, and where's the art part in your background?
I like it. When I applied for the job, and this is good for students here, I wrote a 2-page letter, and essentially the second sentence was, I'm probably not the person you expected to be applying for this job, because I'm an English professor, I do these kinds of things. But I'm not your curator. I'm the person who would help facilitate the curator. So what you need is somebody who can provide a kind of vision and a way of thinking about what this institution can do for people. That doesn't require an art history degree, right? That requires interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence and things like that. And so I was able to kind of tell them that, look, I'm as a teacher, I understand how to scaffold things, right? I understand how to do research. I understand how to communicate complicated ideas to people. And that's what you need in that position, Because if what you have is oftentimes places like this will hire an ex-curator or an artist even. And that's great if they have some administrative know-how. If they don't have the administrative know-how, then everything kind of becomes just about their little bailiwick of things, right? And I think the argument is, I can work with different people and I understand the need to facilitate your staff, right? Like, I want to be able to, I want to be known as the manager who is kind of creating the resources for them to do what they really want to do, right? And it's less about what I know. I mean, I know literature, so I run a book club. So I mean, there's a book club on our calendar. So I do a book club and I do some other kinds of discussion-based things, but the art is for the curators and the educators and things like that.
It's interesting, even at that point, everything, you think about the economy of attention, everything's not okay, right? You still have to manage efficiency.
Right.
And so how do you, either maybe in your space or in your philosophy, manage the efficiency of keeping learning as a focus or keeping that exploration as a focus, knowing that you can say yes to everything,
right?
But everything's not okay.
Right. That's a great question, and we have to think a lot about. First off, we're a limited staff, so the first question is always, is this going to exhaust us to try to do it? Because that's not healthy, right? That's not sustainable. But then you go back to those strategic goals, and you go back to what role do we want to play in the community. So we can and I was really guilty of this when I first got there. I'm a generative, spitball, talk out loud kind of guy, right? And my staff did not know what to make of me at first, because I would just sit. Sometimes I'd just walk around the hall and be like, what if we did da 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 da? And they would all be taking notes. And then like the next day they'd be like, well, I thought about this. And I was like, oh, I was just throwing that out there. Like, so they've learned to have a 24-hour waiting period on any idea that I throw out. But what we do is we talk a lot as a staff, like, is this on point? Is this really about, is this something that we just want to do because we think it's cool? Or is it something that's actually going to serve or that is going to find an audience that's going to be really responsive to that? And the other thing that we've done is to say, how can we not offload it, but how can we ask community partners or encourage community partners to do some of that work in our facility, right? To do some of those programming things because it's really good for them and they're excited about doing it, but we're too understaffed to do it, right? But yeah, it's always a question of, I think my staff, when I got there, I should say, I joke with the staff that they were kind of all they all had PTSD because they all had spent like 2 years doing too much and having either bosses or no bosses. So they were working 50, 60-hour weeks, or, they were like coming in, it was just too much for a small staff and actually a relatively young staff, if I'm being frank. They were really kind of getting burned out and beat up. And so a lot of what I was trying to do was say, we only do what we value and we do those things well. So if we don't value it, we don't do it. If we can't do it well, we don't do it. And if it's a waste of money, we don't do it. So there's this great, there's this book on like nonprofit financial management, and creates this, as all good management books does, there's a quadrant. And it's sort of like, what you want is the star categories. You want the things that have high impact and high rate of return. But what you don't want are like the burden things, right? Which is low impact and no return whatsoever. And there was a lot going on there, right? So we had to really do an accounting of what we do to say, no, that's in that quadrant. That's not worth it. Well, this one person likes it. That's fine. That one person gives $100 a year. We're not doing that. Like those are the kinds of brute force conversations. We've lost not a lot. I've lost several long-term donors because they don't like this particular direction. But what I have to say is, look, the $500 or the $1,000 you give a year, I value it. Thank you. But that's very little compared to what I need to do. The mission is larger than that. And so those conversations can be painful, but I find that actually a lot of my patrons and donors and folks are interested, they get it. I mean, they don't want to see the place die. So you have to kind of adapt, but they also love it when they come to something like what we call a house hang, where we do a pop-up chef, a DJ, and people and a bartender, and so people can kind of come and just have this culinary experience in the house. Well, we did that. We had 125 people, all different ages, all different races from all over the city, right? For this 3-hour, come and go kind of thing. Well, I had a number of people come up. They're like, I can't believe I saw this many kinds of people all milling about in this space. That's the win, right? Even if it doesn't immediately generate the profit, it will down the road. So this is why I really had to lobby the state for the support. I was like, look, what we can do is going to have long-term impact, but it's not going to be immediately profitable. You got to think of us as an entrepreneurial startup in a way, right? I need venture capital so that I need venture capital that I can burn through. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.